So a couple pieces of class business. We're gonna talk about that first. Then we'll have current events by Trenton. I'm gonna talk about on reform, that chapter, the end of that chapter by Cooper. Then we're gonna get into definitions of democracy. We've talked a lot about that this semester, so we'll talk about that. Then we're gonna pause and have a somewhat lengthy discussion about those two pieces I had you read for today. So Mattis and Zerm's piece. That'll probably be about 30 minutes.
So here's the current event from CNN. Niger says that it has blocked the president's escape attempt. So the map there just shows there's a bunch of countries in the Sahel and Sahara area that have had coups in the last couple of years. So how might their colonial history influence their modern political system and the stability?
I know like a lot of those countries that were colonized by the French are still like really economically intertwined with France, so they probably don't have super independent economic systems, which will lead to a lot of like instability for them.
In your paper. So what is the state of democracy in Africa? We've talked about this before. Yes, it's in decline. Yeah, we talked about this when we did our reading before we went on break. So according to some reports, the level of democracy in 2021 is down to 1989 levels. We talked about this. Record numbers of military coups. We talk a lot about coups in this class. Autocratization all over. Only 4 countries have made democratic progress. 11 have declined. That's right, so it's going down. We talked about the supply and demand of democracy, where the supply of democracy is in decline, and so is demand for democracy. This is really important as we're going to talk about public opinion later today. Across the continent, citizens seem to be rejecting democracy. Okay. So in contrast to some optimism about democratic revival in the 1990s, scholars are forecasting a bleak outlook for liberal democracy in Africa, and the question is, why is this? And then what do we mean by democracy? When evaluating a country, how do we determine whether or not it's democratic? What do average citizens mean by democracy? We've talked about that a lot. So give me the rundown on these. So procedural democracy, what's the definition of this? Yes, Joelle?
About like the institutions rather than the outcomes.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yes, focus on the institutions, the procedures of democracy, not necessarily the outcomes. What's substantive democracy? Yeah.
Essentially the same as procedural, but with more emphasis on, I'm gonna call it equality, but in the like equity.
Okay.
Just making sure everybody has the same political freedoms, with more emphasis on women and other ethnic minorities that live within that nation.
Yep, absolutely. I see Joelle.
But on the outcomes rather than the institutions.
Yes, focused on, yeah, the institutions are important, but also the outcomes. Yes, I think I saw Alyssa in the back. I did not see Alyssa in the back. Okay. What about African democracy? Have there been some things? Now, there's not, obviously, we've talked about this, there's not one giant definition that we can apply across the entire continent. But what are some themes that you have picked up as you've done your readings? Yeah, Chase.
One theme I remember was like economic autonomy for the country being really important to citizens.
Yeah, economic autonomy, so not being tied to other countries, say Western countries. Yes, Sam?
I think there's, like reading and stuff, there's been a lot of emphasis on like what the government can do for the people. Like, are they working like with social institutions and social programs to help benefit like the Africans in the country?
Yes. Yep. Social services being really important. Zach?
All of that.
Same thing. Okay, all of that. Okay. And then literal democracy. This one's easy, but anyway, yeah.
Ruled by people.
Why do definitions matter? If countries are evaluated as non-democratic, this has really important implications for aid. It makes them vulnerable to international pressure to change their political systems, their economic systems. Countries might be evaluated as democratic differently depending on the definition of democracy used. If we used a definition that said there are free and fair elections, and that's it. Is Botswana a democracy? Is Kenya at this point a democracy? No. Yes. Okay, what if our definition was free and fair elections, but the same party can't win every single time? Is Botswana a democracy? No, it's not. So see how, depending on how you define that term, whether a country's a democracy changes. Okay, so we're gonna start with Mattis, and then we're gonna talk about Zerman's article. So, as usual, biggest, broadest, easiest questions first. So jump in on these ones if you don't remember all the details. First, what is this paper about? Sam?
I mean, essentially the authors are just analyzing the discrepancy between the Afrobarometer saying like 81% of Ethiopians think that they live in a democracy versus like the general like Western accepted opinion that Ethiopia is not a democracy.
So last question. This is 597 is where you're going to find the answer. What is at stake to Zern if we've got South Africans with one definition of democracy and everybody else with a different definition of democracy? Why is that a problem?
It can really make worse inequality that these countries are facing, specifically wealth inequality. So she talks a lot about how the wealthy are just reaping the benefits of the procedural definition of democracy because they're the ones, and quite frankly, they're not the ones probably enforcing it. Whereas, the people that actually need democracy, who are already in poverty, aren't really receiving anything from this democracy. And if you keep going off procedural democracy and not giving to the poor members of society, is just going to make that income inequality worse.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So it's a cycle that sort of reinforces itself. If you keep emphasizing a procedural definition, then folks who define democracy as my standard of living gets a little better, that doesn't happen. They're continually promised something from democracy and never getting it. What are some of the consequences of that dynamic? Yeah.
Like, because something else she says, it's just going to get violent because nobody can agree on what democracy is. So,
if you are eternally promised a type of government that can never deliver to you what you feel that it should, what are desperate citizens going to do?
Right.
Do what they feel they need to.
They're gonna do what they have to do, yeah.
Seems like she's kind of arguing that like poverty and like economic exclusion is almost directly related to political exclusion.
Yes.
Because if you can't meet your basic needs, if you can't provide for your family, if you can't be secure where you are, how are you gonna even worry about going to vote and participating?
Yes. Yep, that brings up this conceptual disconnect we have between economics and politics. How the Afrobarometer will say, now we're gonna ask you political questions, now we're gonna ask you economic questions, assuming that those don't go together. Yeah, if you're incredibly poor and you are so destitute that you are worried about where your next meal is coming from, are you turning out to vote? Are you thinking about who to re-elect? I don't know about that. That's her point there, which you articulated well. Yeah, okay. Most dangerous is, according to Zern, perhaps the popular loss of confidence in democracy. So when we look at the beginning of all these slides where we talked about what is the state of democracy in Africa, you should be asking yourselves, what type? What are we talking about? Because if we're saying, well, nobody seems to like democracy anymore in Africa, is it that people have gotten really sick of a type of government that doesn't deliver goods to them? Are we talking about procedural and they're really fed up with that? But maybe they really like their own definition of democracy. So how we assess the state of democracy in Africa, whether Africans want democracy, is you cannot analyze that without talking about what type of democracy are we talking about? What are they looking for specifically? Yeah. And who should get to define a term that literally means rule by the people?
The people.
Probably. Okay. All right. Any other thoughts on Zerk?